YouTube channel. You'll be able to ask questions, which I can put to the speakers at the end during the question and answer session. So if you do have questions as we go along, just add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll do a short introductory overview now, and then we will hear from our two speakers today, Sarah Birch and Tom O'Donnell. If we move to the slide. So at the end of this series, all of us, I think, will have a much better understanding of what the term community-led housing is. One definition is that it is an umbrella term encompassing a wide range of approaches to housing that share a common goal of meeting a local housing need via collaboration, empowerment, and mutual support. The diagram here on the left illustrates some of the key characteristics of community-led housing. That it's about living within a community based on collective decision-making and where each resident gets to have a say in how they want to live. Cooperatives, co-housing, and community land trusts are common forms that fall under the umbrella of community-led housing. So one very good reason to run the series this year is that the United Nations designated 2025 as the International Year of Cooperatives, including them under the theme that cooperatives build a better world, and that the United Nations wants to highlight the vital role cooperatives play in driving sustainable development, creating decent work opportunities, and strengthening economies. So if we move to the next slide, please. So today we are going to hear from Sarah on what's happening in Portugal, and as in Ireland, forms of community-led housing have existed for many years internationally. Community-led housing is seeing somewhat of a resurgence. So just to highlight here how mainstream community-led housing is in other countries, we've pulled out some statistics for you. So in Denmark, 8% of the national housing stock is cooperative, and you can see 33% of Copenhagen's housing stock is considered cooperative. In the Netherlands, the state is providing support for community-led housing for older people called Knarenhofs. In our second session, we're going to hear how the municipal authority in Barcelona is supporting the development of community-led housing. And in the final session of this series, we'll move to Germany, where we'll have a speaker from the Hamburg State Agency, which exists specifically to support groups to establish community-led housing through help with access to land and providing advice on financing. So if you move to the next slide, please. So last year, the Housing Agency awarded the Bursary Essay Prize to Hayley Kern of Cooperative Ireland for her essay on housing called Housing Cooperative 2.0, How Could a Cooperative Housing Model Work in the Modern Irish Housing Landscape? This essay is available on our website, and reading it, you will learn about the history of housing cooperatives in Ireland right up to the present day, the challenges that are facing groups today developing community-led housing. What's interesting is that in the 60s and the 70s, 5% of social housing was delivered as cooperative housing. And in 1973, the National Association of Building Cooperatives was set up to represent cooperative housing nationally in Ireland. So if we move to the next slide. So here there's some, I suppose, resources that are available. So we have been supporting and looking at cooperatives and community-led housing over the years. So our website does provide kind of resources there. And on the right-hand side, you see the cover page of Towards Collaborative Living that Sarah Birch, who we're going to hear from next, was co-author of. So if we just move to the next slide. So our two speakers today are Sarah Birch, Dr. Sarah Birch, who is an architect and she's a consultant based in Portugal. She's also, as I said, the co-author of Together, Towards Collaborative Living, and has extensive experience of community-led housing projects across Europe. So she is going to provide an introduction to community-led housing today. Next up will be Tom O'Donnell, who is co-founder and a director of Self-Organised Architecture, which is a non-profit organisation working to promote community-led housing in Ireland, which includes engagement and support for groups looking to set up community-led housing. So you're going to hear about the work that's currently underway that SOA are supporting with different groups across Ireland. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, to share her slides. And thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here today with you and talk a bit about the concept of community-led housing, or as we call it, collaborative housing. So I'm going to share my screen now. So as said, I'm an architect. I'm a Portuguese architect. I recently finished my PhD at the TU Delft on the design of collaborative housing, and I'm also the co-author of Together Towards Collaborative Living. And this is where I'll be mainly focusing my presentation. I will present some of the insights of the book we've done. I will also present some of the findings of my PhD, where I focused on how can the design contribute to create affordable housing through collaboration, so through co-design. And then I will also present what has been done in Portugal in the recent years, because it also is reflecting a new wave of collaborative housing models in many shapes. So starting with the book. So the book was written by Dr. Darinka Ciske, who is an associate professor at the TU Delft. She is also the leader of CoLab Research, which is a research hub at the TU Delft, mainly focused on collaborative living in terms of research. So the book was also written by Maria Pötte, an anthropologist, and myself. So the book mainly addresses the following questions. So why is collaborative living relevant? How can we realize such forms of living? And who should take action for collaborative living to create more affordable cities? So it presents not only the opportunities, but also the challenges to move towards a new paradigm on how to live in the 21st century together. It's a very hands-on book. It provides a lot of specific cases and tools, but it also provides some clarity on the concept of collaborative housing, which is, as it was said, an umbrella term that includes a wide variety of collective self-organized housing forms that can range from co-housing initiatives to eco-villages, community land trust, as it was said, and also some resident cooperatives, where collective self-organization is key to the development. So with all this variety of models, we felt the necessity to develop a project at CoLab Research called the CoLab Mapping Project, where we try to organize and categorize the different housing forms that exist in Europe in what we call the taxonomy. So we realized that many different collaborative housing forms being developed in Europe could be clustered in specific groups. And this was the result of a more qualitative research carried out, which also includes a quantitative perspective, where we provide some numbers on the different collaborative housing forms being developed in Europe. It's a very interactive platform. I invite you to dive in, and it's also relevant to provide the basis for comparative and quantitative studies on collaborative housing, which is still not very much existing. So if the book identifies the different tools that make collaborative housing possible to be developed. So if we think about land, for instance, land is scarce and land is expensive. So how to make land affordable and accessible to self-organized groups to develop collaborative housing projects, and how to pay for the whole development, especially in countries where financing collaborative housing is still not a standard procedure. And what are the necessary tools when different stakeholders collaborate with the end users? And more specifically, what is the relationship between architects and residents in the design phase? So these are some of the questions we address in the book. So we identified a variety of creative measures developed by different cities to provide land that is affordable to these groups. So we have the example of Barcelona, you will hear more about it, or even Amsterdam with leasing land to these groups. We also have the example of Berlin, who used to give priority to these groups when selling public land. We also have a great amount of empty buildings that can be repurposed for housing. And why not give some of this space to self-organized groups to develop their own collaborative housing? And we also have the example of community land trust, which is it's a very interesting model where land is taken out of the speculative market in order to make it affordable on the long run. Also, there are no single way to finance collaborative housing. It's usually a combination of different solutions. We've mentioned already the land, providing land at below market price. We also have crowdfunding being one of the solutions to complement the finance of such projects. And in the book, we illustrate some cities, some examples where, from the perspective of the policy, of the finance, and the different umbrella organizations that contribute to the development of these projects. I'm being a bit. I don't provide many details because the time is is limited. But then, if you have more questions, we can turn back. So all these projects are done under two main concepts, which is co-production and co-design, where doing with is more important than doing for or doing to, which is a more bottom-up, which is a more top-down modus operandi. So here, the future residents are actively involved in the whole process, from conception to management and even maintenance of the building, and they are part of the process. And the relationship with the architect, it's also very important, because here in this process, with specific tools that guarantee the active participation of the residents, the architects need to also acquire specific skills to moderate, to create a more democratic and horizontal dialogue with all the involved stakeholders. And on the other hand, residents acquire a higher sense of responsibility, because they are there from the beginning. So if we think of the concept of affordable housing, which has to do with the ability of a household to pay for their houses without compromising the other needs, as an architect, I also like to think that the way that housing is designed also affects affordability. If we add the element of collaboration, what happens? So in principle, we would think, well, this would increase the costs. Why? Because it requires more time, more management, more people, more minds, different needs and different minds thinking together. But this was actually the challenge that I set up for in my PhD. So the aim here was to understand how could co-design, so collaborative design, help to create more affordable housing solutions. And for that, I looked into 16 different case studies located in Europe. I looked into the process, the design process, and also the design product. And I tried to identify the factors that could influence and affect the affordability of the project. So from a process perspective, I will be also very short on that, but we could see that their involvement from the beginning in specific tasks, they sometimes would even act as developers, and the understanding of housing as a process, that it doesn't have to be ready from day one. It doesn't have to be finished. So through collective self-building or ideas such as flexibility, adaptability, housing could still work and work even better according to the different needs. This would actually have a great and positive impact on the affordability of the project, and also from a more product perspective. So the actual space being built, I could identify these design factors that would also contribute to reduce building costs and increase affordability, not only short-term, but also long-term. So we could see that because people or the residents were involved in the design process, alternative typologies would be developed based on the needs of the specific residents. I could also see a certain reinterpretation of the minimum standards. Also to guarantee a certain quality, but also have control on the costs, we could see that residents were often open to a certain compromise, to certain design trade-offs. So in order to get there, we will compromise there. And this was done because people were involved. And we could see a certain optimization on the ratio private collective. So private units would be usually smaller to allow the building of the common spaces. So common spaces don't have to be necessarily an extra cost, an extra burden, if this optimization is done. So I've conducted a study where I would compare the design features of mainstream housing with collaborative housing in terms of building costs. So I would consider the same surface area, the same construction and finishing standards, but then I would apply these spatial differences, mainly on space and quality. Then these are the numbers. We won't be diving into that, but to finalize, we could say that collaborative housing, because of this alternative and creative typology understanding, we could, with extra quality and smaller private units, but then with the possibility to use a great amount of common space, we could have more optimized costs in comparison to mainstream housing, where we have a simple unit, a little bit bigger, but then with less opportunities. So we can say that building collaborative housing can reduce building costs without compromising and even increasing the quality of the building. Now, talking about Portugal, and I think in terms of timing, I'm okay. What we could see in the past years is a renewal or a revival of this idea of building considering the participation of the residents, alternative tenure models. So this idea of collective property, cooperatives is being somehow bringing forward again. We could see the incorporation of the term collaborative housing in the Housing Act in 2019. And then in 2023, we could see, so from the previous government, we could see two main programs being developed. So one from the Ministry of Housing, which was a program called the New Generation of Cooperatives for the Promotion of Affordable Housing. Here, the main goal was to promote the development of cooperatives in collective property. So it's a bit different from the cooperative movement that we had on the 80s. So here was mainly to promote collective self-organization, more sustainable lifestyles and different living arrangements, and also collective property. So this way, it could be a way to stop speculation, because the property would always be collective, belonging to the cooperatives. And then residents could either rent it or use it through the grant of use model. And in this program, the institute responsible for that promoted pilot case studies, and also promised certain financial support to the development of these pilot case studies. From the Ministry of Labor, Solidarity and Social Security, in the same year, they developed another program, more institutionalized, but the idea here was not to promote collective property, but to promote community living. So the idea here was to somehow turn institutions, mainly senior institutions, into more community-led and community living oriented housing. They set up 2 tenders and many projects applied, and the idea is that they are being built following these principles of collaboration and community living. Oops. Now, from a municipal level, we see, for instance, Lisbon. They followed a different approach, but they also are aiming to promote the development of cooperative housing, and also to bring forward this idea of participation and community-led initiatives. So people would organize to formalize a group and then invest in a cooperative. Also, I will use my case now. I'm currently involved in 2 different collaborative housing projects. So the idea is to include the residents from the beginning through specific design workshops, where together with us, the architects, the housing would be formalized. Also, from a bottom-up perspective, there's a network being created here, very important for the political lobby. So I can say that the launch of the program aiming to promote cooperative housing was also a result of the pressure made by this group. It's called the Rede Cohabitar, so co-inhabiting network, who's been very active promoting, discussing, debating, and making some pressure to the government to provide support and to make it possible to develop this more self-organized housing. Also, from the academia perspective, architecture students are becoming more aware of what is this of alternative typologies, alternative living, community living, participation in design. So it's also very important to start providing the different design tools from the basis, from the architecture schools. And this is a recent edition from an association of architects, mainly focused on cooperatives, this edition. And here are the examples of the residents' cooperatives being currently developed in the big Lisbon, so the metropolitan area of Lisbon. But there is still a lack of clarity on the concepts. There's still a lot of ignorance also from many municipalities. And because of that, I joined forces with 2 other experts from a more organizational point of view and also from a legal perspective to create this consultancy group called Coopera. And the aim is to support the creation and the further development of collaborative housing initiatives in Portugal, because we see a lot of people, a lot of groups who want to start something, who want to start organizing, start building their own project, and they don't know how to start, where to go, what to do. And besides the more, let's say, top-down governmental and municipal support, there's still the need to help these groups in self-organizing.
Sarah, sorry to interrupt. Just to let you know, there's just about 1 minute left now.
Okay. And I only have one slide left. And this is why we've created this this consultancy to help people self-organize collectively. So I could say that to summarize and to finalize, the main takeaways of this is we can consider collaborative housing or community-led housing a viable and a possible way for housing provision. We just make it more possible and get more support. They allow the experimenting and the testing of alternative tenure models and alternative living arrangements. So from a spatial and from a property perspective, it has to be a combination of top-down and bottom-up efforts, I would say, as we can see here in Portugal as it is happening, and I believe in Ireland the same. But we need solid housing policies with concrete support and incentives to make this really go forward. And we can see that the citizen participation and their involvement in the whole process can contribute to provide more affordable housing, which is still a challenge currently worldwide. And we can take advantage of this, let's say, still passive force that can actually contribute to create more affordability in housing. So I think that's it. Oops. And thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Sarah. That was really, really interesting to hear and to kind of get a really good view of what's happening. And as Sarah said, that book is available. There were some questions. It is available in English. And I think we've put the link to where you can find that on the website. So I think a lot of people are very interested in the costs and the results that you found, especially looking at kind of the differences and the choices people make when they're self-organizing. So we'll move on now straight away to listen to Tom, who's going to talk about what's happening on the ground in Ireland. So I'll hand over to you now, Tom. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rosalind.
Can you started to yeah, it's shared there now. We can see that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So I'm just going to introduce community-led housing. To move this Zoom panel over here. So I'm just going to introduce community-led housing in Ireland, kind of as it is at the moment, with reference to a small number of projects that are live at the moment and have been for the last couple of years, and then looking at possible next steps in policy development for the sector. So just very briefly, what is community-led housing? We've heard quite a lot already. So we know it's an umbrella term which includes housing cooperatives, community land trusts, co-housing and self-help housing. But community-led housing was recognised or named in the Affordable Housing Act as an organisation that a housing authority may enter into arrangements with to develop affordable homes. So community-led housing really addresses the following challenges. It provides agency and self-determination for communities to make decisions on homes that fit their present and future needs. It develops socially inclusive housing models and integrates different income groupings generally. Community-led housing provides long-term affordability for present and future generations, rather than just at the initial point of use. And community-led housing is a holistic approach that combines social, environmental, environmental and economic well-being of inhabitants. So a generally accepted description, particularly in the UK, that kind of summarizes these different qualities is that community-led housing is a socially, environmentally and economically sustainable approach to housing with the following features. So there's meaningful community engagement and consent throughout the process. The local community group owns, manages or stewards the homes in a manner of their choosing, and benefits to the local area are clearly defined. So I'm going to introduce very briefly now just the aims and objectives of a couple of projects, of community-led housing projects in Ireland, starting with a project called Upcycling Trust in Cork City. This project is an Interreg Northwest Europe project, and SOA is Irish partner, and we're working with our partners Cork City Council and Cork Community Land Trust, and 4 other European cities, Brussels, Ghent, Rennes and Lille, to develop a community-led approach to circular renovation and affordable housing. So we're developing a civic partnership approach to vacancy and dereliction to develop perpetually affordable homes with the circular renovation approach. So the objectives are to demonstrate the circular upcycling of disused building, to develop solutions and capacity building for local communities, shareholders and governance, and 3, to engage with national and EU policymakers for a rollout of this approach, which is replicable or supposed to be replicable. So just to explain very briefly, community land trusts are democratic non-profit organizations that own, develop and steward land for the benefit of the community in perpetuity. They typically have a tripartite board of trustees, which is composed of 1/3 residents, 1/3 local stakeholders, and 1/3 local authority or government parties and other expertise. Community land trusts often develop permanently affordable homes, but often also other community assets. So they're not just in the business of developing homes. Community land trusts were recognized in the Affordable Housing Act, as we've heard already. So I'd just like to talk about the next project now, which is Nimble Spaces, Inclusive Neighbourhoods. This is the project in Callan in County Kilkenny, looking to provide inclusive housing for people with support needs and for people who need affordable housing in a community with shared spaces for interaction and informal support. So they have already purchased the land, and the land will be stewarded by a community land trust in perpetuity, and they're also developing partnership approaches to development with the local authority and with approved housing bodies. Common Ground Community-Led Housing is a County Wicklow community which was founded in 2018, and they're aiming to develop 25 sustainable homes and shared facilities in a cooperative model, in a variant of cooperative which is called Mutual Home Ownership Society. And that's a model where owners or where residents' initial equity can grow over the life cycle of the building. And as loans are paid off, rent can also reduce. And Common Ground are also looking to have a community land trust steward the land so that the project remains perpetually affordable. The project is looking at low impact, sustainable and affordable homes, which will be developed through a compact design strategy and looking at modular construction. And they're also looking to partner with an AHB. Ashtock is a community housing cooperative in Dublin City. It's an intergenerational housing cooperative, and it's looking to mitigate against the impacts of speculation and gentrification that are pushing distinctive communities out of Dublin city centre. So LGBTQ plus people are especially susceptible to socioeconomic disadvantages. But this cooperative is looking to build on the resilience of the wider community to address particular issues through a housing project. So looking at youth homelessness and older people who face particular challenges in relation to housing and care. This cooperative is open to the city in terms of membership, but also the project itself is intended to be open to the broader neighbourhood. And they're currently trying to get a feasibility plan together. Finally, I'd just like to mention Tógra Tíochta í Ráithig, which is a community-led housing pilot in the Ira Gaeltacht in South Kerry. So there's been a long-term, decades-long population decline in Irish speakers in Gaeltacht Tív Ráithig, due mainly to a lack of affordable homes to purchase or rent for people looking to live there or to relocate. This is exacerbated by a high demand for second homes and Airbnb rentals, and also by high rates of vacancy inland away from the coast. So Údarás na Gaeltachta commissioned us to develop a replicable community land trust approach to increase the number of affordable housing by 10 to 12 homes in a pilot project through the renewal of vacant and derelict properties for affordable purchase, but also to develop new homes under a cost rental scheme. And we also roadmapped finance, governance, and eligibility criteria. So it's probably fair to say that all of these projects that I've just mentioned are facing the same obstacles at the moment. So following the enactment of the Affordable Housing Act 2021, there's been a lack of regulation for community-led housing. And this has led to a lack of recognition amongst state agencies, local authorities, and financial institutions. So even though individual agencies, local authorities, and financial institutions are very supportive of the model in principle, there's no policy pathway to follow. So this leads to a lack of access to land and affordable finance for projects. And there's also a lack of clarity on whether community-led housing projects would qualify for schemes such as cost rental or other social housing schemes, and whether they should be considered as approved housing bodies or what their status is with respect to the approved housing body sector. Community-led housing has its own specific eligibility and allocation plans, which I'll return to later, but Sarah has also pointed to. And finally, in terms of obstacles, lack of a hub or a coordinated task force, as I've mentioned, has left many projects without any orientation as to the pathway to development. So this really lowers the chance of success for a lot of projects we've found. So how do we establish and mainstream community-led housing? This is what we're working on now alongside supporting pilots. So learning key lessons of work done so far, we've sort of established that low interest long-term finance is key to affordability, and low interest state loans can help further innovation and sustainability goals, but also a really broad spectrum of approaches. State-supported hubs de-risk projects by guiding supporting groups to planning and tender phase, and land leasing allows a kind of the state to maintain control of the land in the long term, but also to reduce the cost of the project to eliminate land purchase costs. And land disposed according to a social concept tends to further social policy objectives generally. So building on these learnings, we're now looking to develop policy proposals for an Irish cooperative model based on the right of use cooperatives in Germany, Switzerland, and Spain. So Germany, as we've heard, has a long tradition of cooperatives for over 100 years, and about 5 million Germans live in cooperative homes at the moment. Barcelona, on the other hand, is a completely new sector. Residents only moved into the La Borda project that Sarah described, 2018. But since then, there's been quite a number of very, very successful cooperative projects. So it's a really successful program that's being developed by the city of Barcelona. But what's common to Germany and Barcelona is that cooperatives are able to produce high quality, perpetually affordable housing for people of different ages, backgrounds, and incomes, where communities have agency in the process and in the management of homes long term. So we're testing these preliminary policy proposals at the moment with stakeholders in the next few months, and we hope to launch these proposals at the Social Housing Festival. First of all, we're looking to establish the right of use cooperative principle, so to establish the recognition of the model, which is a model between ownership and rental. We're also looking to establish the principle of cost rental, that housing cooperatives are essentially a cost rental model and that they could avail of cost rental finance streams. Looking in detail at policy instruments in Germany and Barcelona, we find that policy developed there is aimed specifically at nurturing and supporting in the long term the key benefits of cooperative housing. And these are benefits that really only cooperative and community-led housing can bring. So policy is aimed at supporting diversifying supply in the market. It's aimed at supporting an inclusive model, at developing new spatial solutions that are adaptable for people at different life stages. Policy is aimed at supporting communities of interest, so people, groups such as co-workers, older people, LGBTQ+, artists, student cooperatives, and so on. Policy is also looking to support groups with a definite concept, such as intergenerational living and super sustainability, and so on. And finally, policy is aiming to support projects that can contribute to the wider neighborhood, that aren't closed, projects closed off from the surroundings, but open out to neighbors and to provide community use or access to their facilities. So generally speaking, projects are sequenced as follows. So projects, community-led housing projects or cooperative projects, are allocated land according to a procedure. So in Germany, land is allocated according to a social concept procedure, and in Barcelona, according to a negotiated framework agreement. Once land is allocated to projects, they can avail of project support, and this allows them to develop their concepts and ideas to tender stages, at which point they can be evaluated for finance. And generally, projects are structured so that they bring their own equity of about between 5 and 20% of development costs to a project. And this triggers then a long-term state loan, which is typically about 1 to 2% interest. And then groups can also avail of grants and follow other pathways to finance themselves. In Barcelona, we find that ethical banks are also lending at low interest rates, long-term to cooperatives. And lately we've seen that Sostra Civic, Barcelona cooperative, has accessed direct EU funds to supplement locally available funds. So we're really mapping out how projects can be structured within those frameworks. So in terms of land allocation, how is land disposed to cooperatives? Is it a concept-based procedure or according to a framework agreement? How projects are financed. And we're looking at a model which has a sort of diversified source of finance. So looking to leverage residents' own equity up to about 10% of development costs. This is redeemable. So when residents leave the cooperative, they can redeem that 10%. Again, this triggers state long-term loan at low interest. So we're looking at a HFA loan or HFA plus CREL, ideally. So very, very, very low interest. And then we'll be looking further into how the credit union sector or the ethical finance sector in Ireland can support cooperatives. And also, given the new policy environment in Europe now with the Housing Commissioner, we'll be investigating whether cooperatives can avail of direct EU funds. In terms of eligibility and allocation criteria, it's important really to make the point that it's the community itself that co-designs and co-develops the project. So Sarah has sort of outlined the importance of that process. So it's really very important that residents are allocated or self-allocated early to the project. So we accept the basic qualifying criteria as they're set out in the cost rental regulations, of course, with regard to income and so on. But we're proposing a couple of additional qualifying criteria, namely that residents would be member of the housing cooperative, and one or two other minor criteria. We're looking at an inclusive model, so a model that includes people from different income backgrounds. And if we look at the composition of a Hamburg cooperative, according to income groups, there must be a minimum of 30% of low income households in the project, but there can be up to 20% of households who are above the subsidized level and who will pay a market rent, more or less. The other rents are more or less subsidized to a greater or less extent.
Sorry to interrupt you, but if you could just start wrapping up so we can move on to the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a summary of the policy proposal. I don't need to repeat that. And lastly, we're just recommending that research is commissioned into community-led housing and approved housing bodies. So looking at the issues with community-led housing constituted as AHBs, there are assumptions. The last Minister for Housing had assumed that community-led housing groups would be constituted. So what are the consequences for eligibility and allocation, and what are the consequences for projects that want to develop projects other than housing? What are the proportional compliance burdens and oversight regimes? What's the role of the Cooperative Societies Bill within that framework? And then how do we develop partnerships between approved housing bodies and community-led housing groups, as we've seen in the examples earlier? And then how do we put forward these recommendations for policy? So I'll just leave you with our proposed next steps. So we hope to get stakeholder engagement on these proposals, an agreement and launch at the Social Housing Festival in 2025, and look to see how we can replicate the Barcelona model, which has seen a rapid development of the cooperative sector. So thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Great, Tom. Thank you very much for that. I think it's kind of been really informative to have you both together speaking. So we have some questions in the chat box. So kind of conscious of time, I'd like to get through a couple of those questions. I have a couple of my own as well, but we might start with the ones in the chat box and see Q&A box and see how we get on. So I suppose the first question that I think, if we just look at the practicalities of it, I might direct this to you, Sarah. Does it take longer to deliver cooperative housing, considering there are so many stakeholders involved, compared with delivering a private development? So I know you talked about the cost and the kind of in terms of the time to deliver. Does it take longer?
Yeah, time is always an issue when we talk about collaborative housing. I think there's there's an initial phase that it's actually longer because you need to build the group, you need to build the community that will form the whole project. And when you compare it to mainstream housing, that doesn't exist, right? But then the whole, once the group is set and the whole process starts, I think it doesn't have to be necessarily longer. But usually, and we've mentioned this, I think there's still a lack of support, a lack of guidance, and even organization in the collaboration or the collaborative process. So as long as these processes are more streamlined and more organized, they can flow easily or easier.
Yeah. So I might just ask the question to Tom, from your experience with Hamburg, and I know we're going to hear from Hamburg in our last session, but in Hamburg, with that support hub that's there to provide support to community groups that are looking to set it up, do you see a difference in the speed of development, or does it take longer there to deliver, or have you any view on it?
I think it's probably fair to say that it will take longer than a mainstream project to deliver. However, when there is a streamlined process, and the process here is relatively streamlined, certainly in comparison with Ireland, it's a lot easier for groups, and actually you can approach the Agentur für Baugemeinschaften with only a membership of 3, so you can start engagement very, very early and build up a concept very early. It's also worth saying, I think, that cooperatives are developing very future-oriented projects, so they're going to be very adaptable in the future. So the time spent now in planning is going to pay off in the future, and also developing very, very innovative technical approaches to projects. So looking at timber construction and pioneering new approaches there.
Yeah, and you mentioned modular homes here in Ireland as well, being one of the projects you mentioned. Okay, I might move on to another question. This is around, I suppose, again, you mentioned tenure and all different types of housing tenure, Sarah, and there was a lot of mention of rental, but there is also home ownership as part of cooperative or community-led housing. So a question from somebody in the group, sorry, it's just shifted. Yeah, how do these cooperatives avoid being dissolved after a few years when some people want to benefit from the capital gains to be made by selling the buildings? So I know there's structures in place in many, but typically, I suppose, if we could just, is there something to say there, Sarah? Would you have?
Very quickly, and then I think Tom can complement.
Yep.
But when it's private ownership in a cooperative model, I think it's possible to, in the statutes or even in the internal regulation of the group, they can establish a certain limit for sales. So at least they can somehow control speculation by setting these limits. On the collective property model, it's automatically controlled because it's impossible to sell the unit, because you either rent it or you have the right to use, but it's never yours. So you're part of it as a member, and it will guarantee your stability, because you will not leave the group as long as you follow the rules. But it's not yours, so you cannot sell it.
Okay, thanks. And Tom, would you have anything to add there?
Yeah, exactly the right answer. You're going to have a not-for-profit company form, and your relationship with that is on the right of use basis. So there isn't any scope for the cooperative to be demutualized. If that happens, then the assets will have to be transferred to a similar organization. So it can never go back on the market if it's properly structured.
Yeah, we did visit last year a kind of a place in Colchester, cooperative housing there. Again, it was they again had put a structure in where it was all people individually owned their homes. They were able to sell, but it went back into the cooperative to sell, and there was a certain percentage, I can't remember exactly now, that was put on at the market rate to calculate against the market rate. So you weren't, you know, if you owned, you didn't have to stay there forever. You could leave. Okay, so I'm just going to move on. How scalable is community housing?
Tom, you can go with this.
Thanks. Well, I suppose if we look at different sectors, we can see that there's a really big potential for scaling once the model is properly established. So looking at the Swiss cooperative, for example, in Zurich and in Geneva, I think 15% of housing is cooperative housing. And looking at Germany, then we've heard there's probably 5% of housing is cooperative housing. There are about 500 community land trusts in the UK at the moment, and the model is spreading across Europe. There's another 350 models in Europe, I think. Like just to give you an idea of what the ambition of the UK community land trust sector is, they're looking to scale to 5% of the market.
And that was kind of where it was in the 60s and the 70s here in Ireland, from what I've read as well. So,
and if I can complement, I think it's very important to start seeing community land trust in numbers, in percentages, because it's until now it's quite a niche. It's almost marginal. But if we get these numbers ahead and we see that it's growing, and this is one of the efforts with the collab mapping to show that it's a movement, that it's growing, it's getting some consistency, and they have to be acknowledged and included in housing programs, in national housing programs. And I think this is also a way of scaling up this model.
We have many questions, but I suppose that is one. It's around the policy, and I know, Tom, you kind of geared your presentation towards that. But just looking at a question from one person: community cooperative housing is 20% of housing stock in the EU. I suppose it depends where in the EU. We did see Copenhagen 30%. It has zero mention in the National Planning Framework revision. No targets, no outcomes at any level: county, regional, national. Why has then mentions a few departments of housing, deeper Department of Finance and Rural, all decided not to include community housing and the policies in the revision. So, right. Tom, have you an answer for that, or have you any views on that?
Yeah, well, I think cooperatives are essentially cost rental models, as I've mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there is going to be like a huge barrier to addressing a couple of minor policy points to allow cooperatives to avail of long-term finance. I think what we need to start doing is focusing on pilots to really prove the concept, and to get a kind of coordinated effort to do that, and to allow projects to make mistakes, and then to build policy on the learning of that. So we can take some risk.
So there's a mention of working with local authorities and working with the AHB. So you mentioned the work you're doing in Cork, and you have been working with the local authority there. And another question is asking around collaborating with, and you brought it up again in your presentation, around collaborating with AHBs in terms of that. So one question is, would you consider collaborating with the Cooperative Housing Ireland AHB? How would you raise finance using the CREL model without registration as an AHB? Would you have an answer for that, Tom?
I definitely think there's potential in a cooperative or a partnership model to develop cooperative housing, community-led housing, because AHBs have a lot of expertise in development, and they can support community-led housing groups to de-risk their projects. On the other hand, community-led housing groups can bring their expertise in self-organizing and managing the design, co-design process, and they can support the design of the project and then look to take the project over on completion to manage the project long term. So I think there's an established partnership model in the UK that we've been looking at in the last couple of years. That's a partnership model for community land trusts to work with approved housing bodies there, and it's quite successful. And that works on the basis that both parties work to each other's strengths.
Yeah. Okay, and there's a question here from somebody involved in cost rental who says, under the cost rental based approach, will the cooperative members be tenants and benefit from landlord services, or will they be more like owners responsible? So that kind of follows on from what you were saying there about the group responsible for maintaining their homes.
Well, I suppose it depends on how the project is delivered, but as I mentioned, cooperatives is an owner kind of rental model. So you collectively with your other co-residents, you are the owner of the project, but you have a right to use your own apartment and shared spaces. So you pay rent in a cost rental model. Part of your rent is about 15% goes to maintenance and long-term sinking fund for long-term maintenance for the project. So that's already included in the rental calculations. So the project itself should be saving up over the years a sinking fund to address issues such as that. So all of that should be worked out well in advance in the design stage of the project.
Okay, Tom, thank you for that. I'm kind of conscious of time, but I have one further question for Sarah, which is, I suppose, having listened to the presentation from Tom today, and kind of, I suppose, seeing where we are, you're a bit ahead in Portugal. You have, but just with 2023, I suppose it kind of has been given that push. What do you think, in your kind of opinion, what do you think we should be looking to do next in Ireland? Have you any advice for Tom, or more generally?
That's a difficult one. But I think this idea of setting up the movement with pilots, it's essential, because it's not a big scale. They can work as case studies, and they can be the basis to learn with mistakes and to take out the good parts. So I think it's the best approach. But again, it's important to launch these programs and follow them, and not just send them out and then be lost in air, right? Because right now we are experiencing a complicated period here, because we changed the government, and the transition period is delaying a lot the development of these programs. But yes, somehow when launching something, it has to be built in a way that it can go on with all the possible transitions and transformations, right? Because if we see a process that starts and then suddenly it stops because of life and change of governments, for instance, it gives the idea of a certain insecurity, at least in the governmental and even municipal support, and then we are only left with our hopes and strengths as a bottom-up movement. So I think it's to build on pilot cases and long-term processes, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to just move to the last slide, if we have it, just to share our webinars that are coming up next. I'm conscious also that there were a lot more questions that we haven't been able to answer. So I would say there's huge interest. There's a really big interest in what you've spoken about. As Sarah mentioned, her book is available There's a lot of information available, as we pointed out, on our website as well. So the housingagency.ie publication site. But what I'd advise you to do with all your questions is to come to our next community-led housing as affordable housing. So there we're going to hear, you both mentioned Barcelona. So we have Eduard Cabré Romans from Barcelona, who's going to talk about his experience with the municipal authority there, working to develop community-led housing as affordable housing. And then we will again hear from Cork. This time we'll hear from two people involved in the Community Land Trust, Alva Cunningham and Eve Olney. So I hope you enjoyed the session. We'd very much like to thank Sarah Birch and Tom O'Donnell for participating and for really providing so much information there for everybody. I'd also like to thank Tom and the SOA for supporting the series when we kind of started initiating this. So it's great to have your support with it. And I'd like to thank the team here in the agency who have been bringing this all together, in particular Johanna Wiedemann for all her work on this. So thank you everyone for listening. The recording will be available on our Housing Agency YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go and rewatch it and tune in for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.